In the dead of the night, I could hear in my headphones the lifeless noise of the universe. The noise was faint but constant, more eternal than the stars. Sometimes I thought it sounded like the endless winter winds of the greater Shinjin Mountains. I felt so cold then, and the loneliness was indescribable. From time to time, I would gaze up at the stars after a night shift and think that they looked like a glowing desert, and I myself was just a poor child abandoned in the desert. If you were walking home from work and somebody with your somewhat but not super athletic friends were playing pickup basketball and they're like, "Hey, Chris, come play. Could you play?"
Yes, but I don't think it would be a good idea. They're low top, and there's almost no structure, no stability structure to the upper.
Yeah.
So it would, I think you would turn an ankle pretty quickly.
If I were driving on you, I would try to suddenly stop and then get you to
yeah, exactly. You would just hope that I would
and then
fall backwards on my butt.
I would charge the basket and then stop suddenly and then wait for you to fly past. I would try, in fact, I'd try to get past your hips so that you have to go into full pursuit mode, and then I would try to stop again.
That would do it. Yes. Yeah. In the like overly comical version of this skit, like it's mostly just you playing basketball at normal speed and me like entering the frame and then crashing out of the other side of the like. Oh!
There is a really funny. Yeah, exactly. There's a really funny Saturday Night Live skit that was about listener Chris Bagg just illustrated what he's doing. Well, I'll see if I can find the video for that. That was.
And then I got to get the Frankenstein
into our
meme
book?
up too. Let's get into this fucking book. This is rad. I already left my copy over on the table next to Waldo. Hold on. Yeah, I see what all the fuss is about.
Yeah.
And I think I'm really interested in your question about creeping awareness because I think that's part of the attraction, but I am already getting ahead of myself. So everyone, we are doing. Can you help me with the pronunciation here?
Cixin Liu.
What is it?
Or I've sometimes heard it as Cixin.
Cixin. Okay.
Yeah.
Cixin Liu's 2008, but then 2014 translated novel, The Three Body Problem. Hugely successful. Obviously, also turned into a Netflix series. Part of a trilogy, Remembrance of Earth's Past, which is just almost a straight up ripoff of Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past.
And an interest, it's funny because I was reading an article with Cixin Liu today, and he himself refers to it as the Three Body Trilogy, which I think is what most people, I think almost nobody refers to it as the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy.
Well, I mean, that kind of happens to Proust also. Like, people will way more talk about Swann's Way than the Remembrance of Things Past. Like, they lose sight of the big picture group of works and tend to mostly just talk about the individual books. But yeah, that's hilarious. And I love like an author's pragmatism of being like, well, I guess this is what it's called.
I need to make some time to go sit at one of Mr. Reagan's favorite beaches and read Proust. And I have not read Remembrance of Things Past.
With Mr.
But I have
Reagan?
where was Ronald Reagan's favorite beach? I suspect it's in California, so that's actually a plausible thing.
You could do that. You could exhume Mr. Reagan and take a copy of Swann's Way and read Proust on the beach.
Read Proust.
Listeners, we'll do like a special episode of this at some point. But Veronica Gang's immortal Love Something's My Problem. What is it?
Love Trouble's My Business.
Love Trouble's My Business. Yes, Veronica Victoria.
Which I think you and I would enjoy a lot more now, having read Raymond Chandler.
Yes, which certainly.
She is lovingly satirizing, I believe.
But we're already getting distracted, of course. And so one of the things, we're going to have some trouble, everybody, with pronunciation. So we're just going to do our best. But Ye Wenxi is a physicist. She's one of our kind of two main characters of this book, which does flip-flop back and forth between the past and a rough present, sort of early aughts. But we're going to talk a lot about Ye Wenxie, and then also in the audiobook it's pronounced Wong. I'm not sure.
Wong Miao.
Wong Miao. Okay.
Yeah.
So
I'm going to trust the audiobook pronunciations, even though they're a little bit, they don't quite correspond to the spelling, but I think the romanization of Chinese is just wonky.
Okay.
So yeah, in the audiobook that name sounds like Wong Miao.
Yep.
Yeah, it often sounds like Ye Wenxie to
Yep.
me
Ye
when they say
Wenxie.
her name.
Yep.
Also, the cop is
Sha.
It's like, to me it always sounds like he's saying sh or sha, even though it's spelled S-A-H, like dashi. If it's not she, it might be something like sh or sha. But yeah, Ye Wenxie is a physicist. She's a young woman in the 60s, and then in the present, which is probably around 2000, she's in her 60s. And we were with her in both of those time periods. Although generally, when in the 60s, we're seeing her through Wong Miao's eyes, whereas in the present, we're seeing her through Wong Miao's eyes in the 60s, and then when we're seeing she's a protagonist. She's the first or the third person close.
Yeah, she's the person that we follow and sort of goes through the changing action.
Yep. And her father is a scientist, a physicist, who we see beaten to death for adhering to scientific principles during the Cultural Revolution, sort of refusing to kowtow to the Chinese Communist Party and the particularly anti-intellectual bent of the Cultural Revolution. Her sister is a true believer in the revolution, is killed there was conflict between two different parts of the Chinese Communist Army or Red Guard during the Cultural Revolution, and she's killed in one of those conflicts. It's the very first scene of the book, in fact. And Ye is framed for writing an environmentalist memo praising Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which is an illegal book, and she's punished for not denouncing her father. Essentially, she gets in trouble, and then to get out of trouble, they try to get her to sort of rat out her father's associates, and she refuses to do that. And it's maybe we could have expected that she would end up in jail or also tortured or beaten in death, but she's rescued by one of her father's students, Yang Weining, and recruited to work at Radar Peak, which later becomes called Red Coast, even though there's no coast. But it's a mysterious installation in the mountains with a powerful antenna, transmits something that can kill birds.
We switch to the present. We meet our other protagonist, Wong Miao, who is our primary protagonist. And he is... The police and the military are trying to recruit him to be a spy or a mole of an organization called the Frontiers of Science, which is a mysterious organization. And several of their members, physicists, have been committing suicide in large numbers, including Ye Wenxie's daughter, Yang Dong. He meets a tough course police detective who we're sort of coded to dislike at first, named Shi. Who eventually does kind of become a kind of buddy cop version or character who eventually is quite endearing.
He would be portrayed by the Chinese version of who played the older cop in Point Break, Gary Busey.
Oh yeah, that would be great. I was also kind of like I kept picturing Harvey Keitel. That also like anyone from that era, like a sort of
a grizzled, grumpy, doesn't do things by the book, but you kind of like him anyway, sort of tough cop.
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the things that Wong is encountering, he goes out and shoots some photographs with a mechanical camera and discovers that in all of them that he takes the pictures of, there's this mysterious digital countdown. And it's a mechanical camera, so that should not be possible to happen.
Very strange.
And then the countdown actually begins to be superimposed on his eyes. And he gets a message to stop working on his current project. And it seems that there's some connection to the Frontiers of Science. He tries to figure out what's going on with the numbers. He goes sees a doctor. And he learns about this game called Three Body, a video game that one of his colleagues at the Frontiers of Science is also playing. It simulates this world that has this wildly unstable climate. Sometimes it's really hot, sometimes really cold. The weather is totally variable. People can dehydrate themselves during periods when it gets too hot or too cold to try to survive those. And kind of what's happening is civilization is sort of born, goes on for a little bit, and then is destroyed by one of the chaotic periods. And as Wong continues to play the game, he begins to suspect, the purpose of the game is to figure out why is this planet like this.
And so Wong visits Wenxia, mostly because I think Wong was an admirer of her daughter, Yang Dong, and so goes to offer condolences for her daughter's death. And she shares some of her backstory, and also she talks about her time at Radar Peak, which I don't know that Wong is connecting to these other events, although there maybe are some hints that there's some connection to the other events that Wong's experiencing. The three-body game and the the scientist committing suicide and the mysterious numbers. So she tells the story of how over time, when she first got to Radar Peak, she was kind of persona non grata, not trusted, but she gains more trust. She's promoted into more senior roles, operating the equipment, and it turns out that the equipment is a powerful radio telescope and microwave transmitter. And after some lies and red herrings, it's revealed that the true purpose of this equipment is actually to search for extraterrestrial life. Meanwhile, Wong Miao continues to play Three Body and deduces that the game is set on a planet with three suns. He sort of solves the puzzle. Subject to the chaotic movement because the suns are enacting the physics situation of the three-body problem, where they are essentially in chaotic movement around each other, and this poor planet is constantly being ripped out of orbit in one sun and stuck into the orbit of another sun, and sometimes there's two suns, and one times there's three suns, and there's a terrible catastrophe where the three planets are in, I think it's apogee, and this planet gets subject to terrible supergravity, and all the poor people get sucked off the surface of the planet and into the sun. And then this researcher, Shen, who is the person I think that introduced Wong to the game, is shot to death in her home by some kind of unknown assailant, and they seem to be having a disagreement about their commitment to some kind of lord. Mm-hmm. And so there does seem to be this sense of some kind of mysterious enemy that somehow is interacting with Wong Miao, giving him the eye illusions, also interacting with these other physicists that's leading them to commit suicide. It might have some connection to the three-body video game, although at this point in the book, halfway through, none of these things are yet really explained.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that like what you just described goes to one of the central tensions of the book, which is this a conspiracy theory or is this like a horrible natural process? Like all of these things that's going on, the mystery that we are sort of engaged in, and we learn about those two possibilities through the unfolding of the action. And he keeps his cards really close to his chest. And I would say that at any given time, either the conspiracy theory version or the scientific version kind of holds sway. And that's one of the ways that he kind of keeps the narrative ball in the air, which is really interesting. That's a really interesting way to do this.
Yeah, and I'm curious, hopefully, and I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but hopefully you were not, the book's premise was not spoiled to you, because I think that, especially with this book, I've now read this It's actually my third time reading it. But the first time I read it, I remember really enjoying the mystery, and also really enjoying the clues that we were getting. And there's this sort of dawning, creeping hypothesis that begins to form about the relationship of all these phenomenon that I find very satisfying, but there are also surprises that continue. So I'm just curious what your experience of that is. Are you enjoying that sensation? And also, do you want to share any of your hypotheses or suspicions about, what's at the heart of this mystery that Wong Miao is experiencing?
Yeah, I mean, I am super enjoying it. This kind of goes to the question that I've got for you about the what I'm terming the sci-fi expositional problem. But I am really enjoying the mystery because I think that there are just enough clues to keep you turning the page. I think if there were fewer clues, he's really playing it close to the line. Like this could easily tip over into there's not enough information and I don't know what's happening.
What the hell is going on?
Yeah. He does ask a lot of you as a reader. You are thrown into, mid 20th century Chinese history. And you're like, oh shit, it's been a while since I've thought about that. Got to kind of get myself back up to speed in that direction. And then, oh my gosh, we're in the present, and now there's a lot of hard science that I also have to absorb. And I think the thing that tethers it all together is the weirdness of the video game. And because the video game is so weird, if you're in my position and you don't know what's going to happen, you're like, what the fuck? He's just this sounds like a terrible game, first of all. And all these awful things happen. It's this total dystopian. People are dehydrating themselves into leather so they can be both carried around and surviving these just horrible things. But the game...
And sometimes rats eat the leather people, exactly. And they get rehydrated and they're missing a finger or something that.
There are wonderful little moments of comedy in this book, and I want to... I think, if we have time, one of them I want to bring up at a certain point. And that is one of them. That, after rehydration... a person on this world is my finger is gone, and other people are count yourself lucky. Those of us that were not in the dehydratories, some of them had their heads chewed off by rats. And you're you can just hear the author being
it's dark.
Well, you know
humor.
what? I've created this fucking weird world. Why don't I have a little fun with it here and there? And so what's great is that the video game in the book operates in much the same way that a video game operates in the real world, except that it's like you're playing a game, but you haven't been allowed to play the tutorial. You just sort of dropped in. There is this very famous late aughts video game called Dwarf Castle. It's and it's the old character-based video game, sort of, not like adventure, but, where the walls are kind of drawn with X's and whatnot. It's intensely complicated. There's no rules. You don't really understand what you're doing or what the point is. And what's great about this is every time he returns to the game, he has another little clue. And so we kind of alternate between game action and real-world action. And the two of those kind of contribute to the unspooling of what is happening here? Because at first you think, okay, something horrible scientifically is about to happen. There's this little kind of side quest where he goes off to an observatory and discovers that something really weird is happening with the cosmic background radiation. There's this great researcher who's it's been 0.27 Kelvin for the last 50 million years, and it's gonna be for another 100 million. And that particular night, there's a 5% fluctuation in the temperature, which is just
And,
like,
and he has gotten a message that that's going to happen
Yeah.
too
Yeah.
by some mysterious entity. Yeah, absolutely. And as you're saying this now too, I'm remembering the first read. I remember the sensation of the first 100 pages or so being like dense and intriguing and disorienting, and having the sense of like, there's some great moments here, but I really don't know what this book is about. And really the moment that changing was when Wang Miao enters the room of Shen and she's playing the video game
yeah.
for the first time. And so you have this like middle-aged lady wearing what is sort of like something you'd expect more like a teenage, this VR suit. This, I think it's even called like a virtual suit or something
V-suit.
like that.
Yeah.
A V suit. And she's playing this, and it's a little bit out of character. You wouldn't expect like a 50-year-old woman to be playing like addictively this video game. And then we're pretty quickly after that brought into the game. And I do agree, my recollection is that in reading this, the game gives you something to kind of cling to. And it's weird, but it's also very specific and very memorable and very fun, I think, too. Yeah. And there are these little clues. I also have the sense, we in the section we read, Wang Miao basically solves the game. He figures out what's going on. I do remember, I think I came up with the hypothesis that there were more than one sun on my own, like
Nice.
based on
Wow.
those clues.
That's impressive.
And I remember even thinking that the flying stars were other planets, although there's a very specific explanation for why the suns shrink and then suddenly a flying star is where the sun was, having to do with the visibility of the outer core of the sun and inner core of the sun. But I think I definitely remember that the game did create this sense of like structure to this book that was kind of missing prior to that point. And I do remember it being very difficult. Like this, I do remember having the sense of like, I'm going to stick with this for 100 pages and then see if I still want to read it, because it's kind of hard.
Yeah.
And then getting to that point and be like, no, I'm in now. I'm completely in and I'm being pulled along. But that, like many of the books we've read, I certainly... I sort of felt this way about, The Broken Earth, the first, whatever the first book, but also Octavia Butler's book, Parable of the Sower. Felt that way about that. Felt that way about a few of the other books that we've read too, where it's like, yeah, I'm hooked, but it took me longer maybe than it should have. Although I also think part of that is that we're as readers not very familiar with the Cultural Revolution, and so there's all these, so everything that's happening to Ye Wenxia, we don't really have the context for it, and we're like, wait, why are these Red Guard factions fighting, and why is her father being tortured, and wait, why does she now seem to be okay? And it's like, I feel like if you grew up as Cixin Liu did, he can remember the Cultural Revolution a little bit. He was a child, but he remembers kind of the emotional feeling of it. Maybe you're less disoriented by those first 100 pages too.
Yeah. I think, another thing that really tethered me to it is it instantly recalls a Larry Niven short story called All the Myriad Ways, where basically a discovery is made that there are millions of multiple realities, and that, so you are just one of many million of yourselves scattered throughout. Right. And the action of the short story is that people just start killing themselves because they're like, well, why not? Like, doesn't matter. There's just 999,999 more of me out there. And so it like that, I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I wonder what's going on in that direction. And then in the other direction, sort of like the less super highfalutin sci-fi, I was like, oh, this is interesting. This is sort of like another take on Ready Player One, whereas Ready Player One is much more of like an entertaining romp. This, I was like, oh my gosh, what is happening with this game? This is really interesting. And I mean, there's so many books that are about people that end up in games. Tron. Yeah. Like it's a trope. And what I think is so interesting about this book is that it feels like he is kind of upending a lot of different tropes at the same time, though I'm not quite sure which ones.
Right. And well, it's interesting too, because like you could argue in a way that there is a kind of cyberpunk quality to this, because the game is sort of functioning as this alternate reality. And also there's a society that is forming around the people who play the game, and that gets developed a little bit more later. I don't remember if in this section there's been a meetup yet. I think maybe there was one meetup in the first half of like game enthusiasts, but one of the other things that happens too is Wong starts trying to figure out sort of like who in his version of the game are NPCs, and who are other players like him, and he's guessing about that. Although there's this one moment where I think like he's about to be burned at the stake, and Isaac Newton flicks a Bic lighter at him, sort of evilly, right? And you're like, that, or a Zippo, and you're like, yeah, that's probably one of the players, right? Like, or it's just a weird quirk of this game too. But yeah, the game is also leaning into the surreal and the bizarre, and
that scene was amazing. He's Copernicus. There's Aristotle is there. Galileo is there.
That's actually my first reading.
Yes, great. I can't wait to get there.
Yeah.
So, well, my first question kind of dovetails with this one, and I sort of feel like I've talked a little bit about it already. But I mean, the game is one of the primary expositional avenues of this book, and we've talked about this before. How do you get the complicated information from your brain to the reader's brain? And like, how do you see the other than the game, how do you see the exposition happening in this book? And is it working for you?
It is, although I think that one of the things we've established is I have a very high tolerance for sci-fi limited exposition that I have a high tolerance for sci-fi books where the reader has to work a little bit to make sense of the premise, and my mind very much enjoys those puzzles, and I seem to instinctually recall sort of details and hints in a way that makes that pleasurable. I'm remembering sort of my experience and your experience and Lindsay Lajoie's experience of Neuromancer, and how you two both found that a lot more frustrating than I did. So it does work for me quite well, and I certainly feel like I was really enjoying it. And I think you're right that that part of the mastery of Cixin Liu here is a real sense of balance, because he's also this book does have like. It does sort of read like a 1970s Larry Niven novel. Like there are just long sections where they're like, well, the radar peak is actually controlling a microwave unit. It was originally a level 17 microwave unit, but now we're up to a level 15 microwave unit, which is too broad to escape the Earth's reversed polarity negative gravitational field. There are long sections where characters say things like that to one another. Yeah. And, you could argue that that's not necessary or less craft, but I think that it's important for Cixin Liu that everything... this is very much a book of ideas, and it's a book of values, and it's a book where the characters have emotional stake in the world, and we're kind of asking the big questions in some ways. I don't want to give too much away about the premise of the book, but it's also, I think it's important for him. He's not doing what Ursula Le Guin or N.K. Jemisin do, which is just sort of hand wave away the explanation.
Totally,
There is always a physical explanation, for everything that's happening, and the ideas and the emotions of the book, I think, follow the science and follow the big pictures. And it's interesting, people reviewing these books have described them as not being character driven, which I don't fully think I agree with. I think the characters are so important to this story. Although I guess you could say that Wang Miao is a sort of like generic stand-in for the reader's curiosity. But Ye Wenxia to me seems like a very profound character. In fact, maybe I'll skip to my second reading.
She's a hero. Yeah, and like, I don't know, the reason I asked it was because I noticed that even though I was engaged, I was like, wait a second, we're having another conversation, aren't we? And it was the conversation.
A lot of what Hollywood calls chalkboard scenes.
Yeah, there we go.
I don't know if Hamlet Hit Points has a version of this too, and a lot of pipes.
Totally. Yes, so many pipes. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, also that I am just kind of interested in physics and astrophysics. So to me, engaging with those ideas. I don't find that particularly
Yeah,
boring.
I-
I sometimes read nonfiction books about the same topic. So
Totally.
like, you know, it's I have a high bar for that. I think that there are probably some readers who would be fatigued by the hard sci-fi-ness and the expositionalness of this book, but I think it really pays off. And I also think a lot of the payoff of that happens in the second half of this book when you start realizing what's actually going on.
Oh my God, I can't wait.
And
Yeah.
there is a sort of like Get Out like quality to that, you
okay.
know, as in the like, you know, the horror movie where you're like, you know, that's messed up. You know, like there are, and even this book has the like, there's there's that sort of like little wonderful digression about the shooter and the farmer.
Yes.
To
Oh my God,
which
just so
I
great.
think is a tonal foreshadowing of the second half of the book. But again, I don't want to give too much away. Maybe. Actually, I think I might reverse the order of my readings. I had
Okay.
two that I wanted to do, but here is one. If I were going to make the case that this is a character-driven book and not simply not simply a sci-fi book of ideas, this is one of the sections I would point to. So Wang Miao is visiting Ye Wenxia, and she's talking and reflecting on her time at Red Coast Base. And she's about gotten to the end of the story. We learned that essentially the base was decommissioned in the 80s after there was just less interest in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And she's reflecting on this. And she says to Wong, "The search for extraterrestrial intelligence is a unique discipline. It has a profound influence on the researcher's perspective on life." Ye spoke in a drowned-out voice, as though telling stories to a child. "In the dead of the night, I could hear in my headphones the lifeless noise of the universe. The noise was faint but constant, more eternal than the stars. Sometimes I thought it sounded like the endless winter winds of the greater Xinjiang mountains. I felt so cold then, and the loneliness was indescribable. From time to time, I would gaze up at the stars after a night shift and think that they looked like a glowing desert, and I myself was just a poor child abandoned in the desert. I thought that life was truly an accident among accidents in the universe. The universe was an empty place, and humankind the universe was an empty palace, and humankind the only ant in the entire palace." This kind of thinking infused the second half of my life with a conflicted mentality. Sometimes I thought life was precious and everything was so important, but other times I thought humans were insignificant and nothing was worthwhile. Anyway, my life passed day after day accompanied by this strange feeling, and before I knew it, I was old. Wang wanted to comfort this old woman who had devoted her life to a lonely but great enterprise, but Ye's last speech caused him to sink into the same sorrowful mood. He found that he had nothing to say except, "Professor Ye, someday I'll go with you to visit the ruins of Red Coast Base." Ye slowly shook her head. "Xiao Wang, I'm not like you. I'm getting on in years and my health isn't what it used to be. It's hard to predict the future. I live my life day to day." Looking at the silvery head of hair on Ye Wenxia, Wang knew she was thinking of her daughter again.
Yeah, that's about as character-driven as you can get.
Right. And it's evolved. I mean, it all starts with, let me tell you what listening for extraterrestrial life for 20 years of your life late at night with headphones does to you.
Yeah.
That's where we're starting. We're starting with the hard science, but now we're talking about loneliness and sadness and about whether life is an accident and whether it has any meaning and whether humanity has any meaning, and this image of humanity as the only ant in an empty palace.
Yeah, it's just amazing. Yeah.
It's extraordinary, and it does feel a little bit overwritten, but I also just wonder if some of that is just translation, you know, that there might be poetics and things that just don't carry to English, you know, sort of things like Wong wanted to comfort this old woman who had devoted her life to a lonely but great enterprise, but Ye's last speech caused him to sink into the same sorrowful mood. Kind of an unnecessary sentence. I think you could just cut to the dialogue there, you know.
Yeah, there is a bunch of telling in this book. And again, kind of like the expositional thing, it doesn't bother me. And
Yeah.
I think the reason why is, and you're sort of getting at it, is that like in a book of hard science fiction, like there's kind of enough to absorb, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think that it might be one of those things where like our literary brain is kind of working on overtime
Yeah.
to deal with the like these concepts.
Cixin Liu is like, I'll just break it down.
Right, yeah, let's just
I'll
like,
just tell you how the
here's he
characters are
feels.
feeling.
This
Yeah.
is what's going on. And it's funny. The reading I picked is actually also about the cosmic background radiation. So we're on similar ones,
Yep.
and I think it's because like those are some of the more lyrical sections of the book when what he's talking about is actually just like the background hum of everything.
Yeah.
Which is, and like we also learned that like the background hum of everything like is still warm, but when we say warm, it's like hovering a few fractions of degrees above absolute zero. It's incredibly cold.
Right.
And I just think that the way that he manages these hard ideas into the emotional realm is the thing that has me like really hooked. Because I think care about these characters, like you're saying.
Yeah.
It is a character-driven book because, like, I think the moment I was hooked was when Wang Miao is about to turn down the job, and the detective Shah is like, "Good, I'm glad you're a wimp."
I'm glad. Yeah.
and
you
Wong
would be.
is
What
like,
does he say? He says like you would be like shredded horse meat in or something like that in like a matter of. And he says it after Wong has already walked out.
Yep.
And he's clearly baiting him,
Yeah,
right?
totally.
Like he's clearly baiting him to come back. And that's also the first moment I think you really like Dasha.
Yeah.
Too is you're like, oh, he's kind of a amusingly manipulative old bastard, isn't he? And
as he
kind of
says
fun.
many times, he is not a good cop, but he is an effective cop.
Right.
And
Who said I was a good cop?
I know, it's so great. His dialogue is the best. Like he sees Wong at one point like weeping outside in the street because he's supposed to be following him. And instead of comforting him, he's like, "See, I knew you couldn't stand up to it. You loser."
Yeah.
And like,
I mean, just think, I really think that Dashu is like, this book would be vastly diminished without him as a
entirely.
character.
Yes, because
Especially since Wong doesn't have much personality too, and I think that's necessary because Wong, in many respects, just has to be kind of like the filter with which the reader is absorbing clues, essentially, as to what's going on, and so he kind of has to be our Dr. Watson, right? You know, and then you need a Sherlock Holmes, right? You need, and not that Dashu is similar to Sherlock Holmes in many respects, but that you need a memorable personality too. And so Dashuk slowly becomes this sort of lovable sidekick, who we come to really like, even though objectively, I mean, apparently, like he gets in trouble for like beating up suspects or
all the time.
You know, other things like that really we probably ought not approve of, but. You know, he somehow manages to do all those terrible things with a twinkle in his eye.
Okay, I've got a reading. This is when when Wong has gone to the researcher and sort of discovers the background noise temperature fluctuation.
Yep.
And I think actually it's great that you just read the one that you did, because Wong is essentially doing the same thing that did for her career, and so we get some of the same lyricism and whatnot.
And this is also after, you know, like the researcher who's helped him out is like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard about, right? Like, we're gonna. It's like basically like, what are we gonna like? What's next? Are we gonna go like make sure the sun rises tomorrow? Are we gonna go ensure that like the South China Sea is still there?
Like, yeah, exactly.
You know, like,
and then it happens, and what's great is the researcher is suitably terrified. Like one of the things that gets the mechanism of dread in this book is the way that things that are normal and commonplace are suddenly ripped out from underneath you. And like one of the inciting incidents is another one of the intellectuals who is drunk because, first of all, his wife has killed herself. And second of all, because he has sort of helped make this discovery that physics doesn't work anymore.
Right.
And which is terrifying to scientists because, you know, the rest of us might not understand the import of that. But the red light had come from more than 10 billion years ago. It was the remnants of the Big Bang, the still warm embers of creation. He could not see any stars. Normally, since visible light would be compressed to invisible by the glasses, each star should appear as a black dot, but the diffraction of centimeter wave radiation overwhelmed all other shapes and details. Once his eyes had grown used to the sight, Wang could see that the faint red background was indeed pulsing. The entire sky flickered, as if the universe was but a quivering lamp in the wind. Standing under the flashing dome of the night sky, Wang suddenly felt the universe shrink until it was so small that only he was imprisoned in it. The universe was a cramped heart, and the red light that suffused everything was the translucent blood that filled the organ. Suspended in the blood, he saw that the flickering of the red light was not periodic. The pulsing was irregular. He felt a strange, perverse, immense presence that could never be understood by human intellect. Wang took off the 3K glasses and sat down weakly on the ground, leaning against the wheel of his car. The city at night gradually recovered the reality of visible light, but his eyes roamed, trying to capture other sights. By the entrance of the zoo across the street, there was a row of neon lights. One of the lights was about to burn out and flickered irregularly. Nearby, a small tree's leaves trembled in the night breeze, twinkling without pattern as they reflected streetlight. In the distance, the red star atop the Beijing Exhibition Center's Russian-style spire reflected the light from the cars passing below, also twinkling randomly. Wang tried to interpret the flickers as Morse code. He even felt that the wrinkles in the flags flapping next to him and the ripples in the puddle on the side of the road might be sending him messages. He struggled to understand all the messages and felt the passing of the countdown second by second. He didn't know how long he stayed there. The planetarium staffer finally emerged and asked him whether he was done. But when he saw Wang's face, sleep disappeared from the staffer's eyes and was replaced by fear. He packed up the 3K glasses, stared at Wang for a few seconds, and quickly left with the suitcase. That is quite a piece of writing.
Yeah.
Lyrical, beautiful, poetic, dense with information.
And this idea that, right, once this sort of constancy of the cosmic background radiation is disrupted, then what else might be subject to whatever this force is?
Yeah.
That ripple, that leaf. I love the poetics of that too. And again, but it's all emerging, from the sci-fi premise here too. The other thing, it's funny, all this, you're talking about the difference between, is what's happening some kind of like natural disaster, some kind of collapse of the universe, or is what's happening some kind of conspiracy? And it just makes me, for some reason, this section reminded me of hearing about a card trick that Penn and Teller did, and then often what they'll do is explain the tricks. And so they cause somebody to pull a particular card from a particular deck, and then they're like, okay, who were you here with tonight? Okay, I want that person to reach under their seat right now and pull around, and that person pulls out an envelope, and the missing card is in that envelope. And then they're like, yeah, what you need to understand about magicians is that we're the kind of people who are going to show up 2 hours before the show and tape that card underneath every single seat. And then he's like, everybody else reach under your seat. And, and then at port, the trick is much less impressive, or maybe, depending on your point of view, much more impressive because it's much more effortful. But it's also, you realize that often magic And the blinking of the cosmic background radiation is something like an intimidating magic trick
Yeah.
that is happening to Wong Miao right then. Often magic is a lot cheaper than you realize in that particular moment.
Yeah, I mean, and just the question, like you're saying, this is a question of perception. Because, like, if you don't look under the chairs, it's an amazing magic trick. And then if the magicians widen your perspective to include all of the information, suddenly, like you said, it's a much less impressive trick. And what Wong is seized with at this particular moment is this desperate attempt to understand. Like, he's very quickly trying to, like, what do the flickering lights of the cars mean on the spire of the Beijing Center? And like you just said, he is suddenly attacked by the understanding that he knows nothing. And then like when we hear from later, that sense of being an ant in the empty palace of the universe really hits home. There's a lot of Hamlet in this book. We get a lot of To Be or Not to Be. He also just drops the phrase undiscovered country without talking about Hamlet. There's enough of it here that it's like we can't ignore it. And like that's, another great work about why are we here? Like, what are we doing?
And I would say that also that theme of this entire series is full of moments where characters are facing a kind of looming crisis or catastrophe, but there's also time. It's like there's nothing you can do about it, but also you don't have to do anything about it at this particular moment other than live with the awareness of whatever it is that you're being made aware of. And to me, that feels like that's very Hamlet too, right? This sort of sense of interminable waiting for an inflection point that may never come, and what that restlessness is like. And it's a very sophisticated literary theme, and I don't know. It actually, the more I think about it, the more annoyed I get at this notion that these aren't character-driven books. I think what maybe people mean by character-driven is something more like Star Wars or Guardians of the Galaxy, where it's more like your crew of friends, your the sort of found family stories of a Star Wars, which is great, right? Like, who doesn't want to hang out with Luke and Leia and Chewie and Han and the droids all day, I wonder if that's what people mean when they mean character-driven sci-fi, or if they mean something else. Because to me, this feels imminently about humans and about human emotions and about characters, but that just doesn't seem to be the standard description of these novels.
Yeah, which is odd because really, like, so much of Ye's experience is predicated on the horrible trauma of watching her father beaten to death in public.
Yeah.
And then Wong, like, you're right, a little bit more of an everyman, but he cares. Like, he deeply cares about his colleagues and really the state of science and what the world means. And then once you drop Shaw in, you're like, yes, the events of the book would probably still unfold without these characters because the events of the book are so big and titanic that they kind of unfold regardless. But that's just life. And I think that maybe the characters aren't super driving the plot forward. Like, we are a little bit in Diamond Age world where,
especially with Wong.
The protagonist is essentially here to go places and talk to people and receive information from those places so we can understand it. But, like, I believe him as a person. There is a cynical side of me that would want to know the ethnicity of those reviewers that said that this is not character driven.
Oh, interesting.
And wondering about a kind of Western arrogance about who gets to be a character. But without
You know,
knowing
one of
the
the
reviewers, I can't follow up on that.
Yeah. Well, I think one of them was a British bookseller,
Mm-hmm.
so that would fit. Um, because I read an article in the Guardian
Mm-hmm.
about sort of Cixin Liu's popularity in the UK and
Mm-hmm.
London in particular. You know, they weren't sure when his book was translated. You know, I think it was Tor. They liked it, you know,
Mm-hmm.
like the publisher liked it, but they weren't sure whether these books were going to be successful or not. And
Wow.
then apparently, also what happened, a lot of the market in the West was driven by Chinese students, um, you know, international students,
Yeah.
essentially, who
Cool.
are Chinese but based in London or based in the United States, buying the book too, which was also surprising to people because I think that publishers were not aware that there was a market. But by the way, they were buying it in English. This was the English
Oh, cool.
translation.
Interesting.
Yeah. Which I think, and I wonder if they'd read it in Mandarin,
Mm-hmm.
and then and then were excited to read it in English.
Oh, that's
you know,
so
as
cool.
like imagine if you grew up somewhere, then went to school somewhere else and learned that language, and then your favorite book came out in that language.
It would be
you know,
great.
like
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I have another reading. This was originally going to be my first reading, but this was more, I think, well, I think it speaks to kind of the dawning awareness, the creeping awareness, and also I think the pleasure of the creeping awareness, and also just the surrealism
Yeah.
of the three-body video game too.
Oh, sweet.
So-
Yes, I'm so stoked.
So
to hear
this is the Copernicus chapter where Wong thinks he's figured out what's going on, that there are in fact three suns, and he has explanations for everything. And the patriarch of this particular civilization is Pope Gregory. And so Wong explains what's happening, and the other people, you know, including, I want to say Galileo, is Newton. I think Newton is in this one
Aristotle's
too. Or
there
maybe
for sure.
Aristotle.
Yeah.
They're skeptical, and at one point Pope Gregory just says, burn
Burn
him.
him. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll start the reading then. This is just after he's been sentenced to being burned. Wang Miao was seized by a nameless terror. He shouted, "Don't do this! Let me go! I'm telling the truth!" If you're telling the truth, then you won't be burnt to death. The game rewards those who are on the right path. As Aristotle grinned, he took out a silver Zippo lighter, flipped it in his hand in a complicated fashion, and then flicked it on. Now, I will say, like, I think the translator could have done better than complicated fashion. But that breaks the spell a little bit. But I love the idea of Aristotle flicking a Zippo. As he's about to light the firewood piled around Wong, a bright red light filled the entrance tunnel, followed by a wave of heat and smoke. A horse dashed out of the light and into the great hall. Its body was already on fire, and as it galloped, the wind whipped it into a ball of flames. The rider, a knight in heavy armor that glowed red from the heat, dragged a line of white smoke behind him. "The world has ended! The world has ended! Dehydrate! Dehydrate!" As the knight shouted, the animal under him fell down and turned into a bonfire. The knight was thrown some distance and rolled all the way to the stake, where he stopped moving. White smoke continued to pour out of the openings in the armor. The sizzling grease from the dead man inside oozed out on the ground and caught fire, giving the armor a pair of burning wings. Everyone in the great hall streamed towards the entrance tunnel and squeezed into it, disappearing in the red light from outside. Wang Miao struggled with all his strength until he was freed from the ropes. He dodged the burning knight and horse and dashed through the empty great hall and ran down the sweltering tunnel until he emerged outside. The ground glowed red like a piece of iron in a blacksmith's furnace. Bright rivulets of lava snaked across the dim red earth, forming a net of fire that stretched to the horizon. Countless thin pillars of flame erupted towards the sky. The dehydrators were burning. The dehydrated bodies inside them gave the fire a strange bluish glow. Not far from him, Wong saw a dozen or so small pillars of flame of the same color. These were the people who had just run out of the pyramid. The Pope, Galileo, Aristotle, Leonardo. The fiery pillars around them were translucent blue, and he could see their faces and bodies slowly deforming in the flame. They focused their gaze on Wong, who had just emerged, holding the same pose and lifting their arms toward the sky. They chanted in unison, "Tri-Solar Day." Wangs looked up and saw 3 gigantic suns slowly spinning around an invisible origin, like an immense 3-bladed fan blowing a deadly wind toward the world below. The 3 suns took up almost the entire sky, and as they drifted towards the west, half of the formation sank below the horizon. The giant fan continued to spin, a bright blade occasionally shooting above the horizon to give the dying world another brief sunrise and sunset. After a sunset, the ground glowed dim red, and the sunrise a moment later flooded everything with its glaring, parallel rays. Once the 3 suns had completely set, the thick clouds that had formed from all the evaporated water still reflected their glow. The sky burned, displaying a hellish, maddening beauty.
It's really good.
Yeah. And I think this is what we're here for, right? Like I mean, and I do think this is a book about characters too, but this first book is kind of a little bit of a horror story in a respect, and the horror isn't a monster that hides in your closet with razor hands or with sharp teeth. It's but there is this sense of menace and threat. And even though Wang Miao is in theory safe, right? He's playing a video game. The horror and the beauty of all of this come through so brilliantly, and just this capacity to imagine, a very simple a billiards ball physics problem, a 3-body problem, and then imagine what it would be like to be on a planet if 3 suns were operating like that. I don't know. I admire that so much.
Yeah, the height of the imagination is the thing that gives wings to the whole novel. And he appears to also be an excellent writer. So he's like one of those things where you're like, God damn it, you can hit 40 home runs and steal 40 bases? Are you kidding? That's not fair. That's a lot of very difficult thing to be able to do.
And it's hard to know. I mean, I do think there's a clunkiness to it, but I think that might just be that might just be translation. My understanding is that a lot of the characters' names have a kind of poetic symbolism that is probably lost on most of us too. And so it would be really interesting to have enough Mandarin to read this in the original language and see how it worked in that language too. But certainly the vividness of the imagery for sure comes through.
Is intense. Yeah, it's great. I mean, you kind of adjust your, you shouldn't do this, but I think we all do, is that you somewhat adjust your literary expectations depending on what you're reading. And I think that's what you're talking about, is we accept a small amount of clunkiness or a small amount of overwriting, because the rest of it is just so captivating.
Yeah, and I think the same holds when you're reading a much older work too. Like if you're reading Shakespeare in Middle English, or even reading Frankenstein, or even I would even argue A Study in Scarlet or Dracula. There's something a little bit old-fashioned about the language that I think we just sort of forgive, and you sort of you peer through that for the essence.
Yeah. Well, I could go to trivia.
Okay. I think you're going first.
I am the host. So this is a Netflix series question. You don't have to have seen the series in any way, but it was a striking enough piece of news that I couldn't pass it up. So in 2020, a few months after the Netflix series was announced, what Game of Thrones-like event occurred between the show's executive producer and one of his subordinates? And it was sparked by a disagreement about how the show was being produced by the subordinate. A, the subordinate poisoned the executive producer, resulting in the death of the executive producer. B, the executive producer cut the subordinate's hand off in an honor duel due to the severity of the disagreement. Or C, a bear was used in the shooting of early scenes, and the bear escaped and cornered the two producers, who escaped by climbing a fake wall that was part of the set.
Of all of those, the only one that seems plausible and seems like I plausibly would not have heard about it is C, even though it also seems rather implausible. But I think it's the bear. C.
Sadly, it's the poisoning.
No!
Yes, the subordinate producer poisoned the executive producer because of a disagreement they had, and the executive producer died.
Really?
Yes, the subordinate producer murdered the executive producer.
Was that before Benioff and Weiss were involved, or like did they come and take it over, or is Benioff or Weiss dead?
No, not. But I get the feeling because this was a few months after it was announced, so it probably wasn't like fully in production quite yet. You know, but yeah, wild.
Oh my god!
I know, what a crazy. I found it and I was like, "Is this real?"
Have you read? I want to say it's Gary Steingart's humorous fictitious account of the Russian who stabbed the other Russian in Antarctica for spoiling the ending of Anna Karenina.
No. I haven't, but that's wonderful.
Fortunately, the man who was stabbed survived. By the way, if I was trapped like indoors and I was reading Anna Karenina and like the person I was trapped with spoiled it for me, that person better watch their back for knives.
Have I told you my separate piece story? Do you know
Yes.
this? Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yes.
Dies.
Oh my
Sorry,
God!
everybody.
You just did it, Jesse.
Okay, so Cixin Liu, when he was a kid, found a banned book in a box of his father's things, and he read the book secretly, and it directly inspired this novel. Was that book A Study in Scarlet by Arthur Conan Doyle, B, Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, C, Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne, or D, The Mote in God's Eye by Larry Niven and Jerry Purnell?
What was option B?
Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke.
I'm gonna go with Journey to the Center of the Earth.
Correct.
No way.
Yeah. Now, how did his father get a Mandarin copy of that book? I have no idea. Maybe there was like a smuggling pipeline from Hong Kong. That's the only thing I can think of. Although they speak
that makes
Cantonese in
sense.
Hong Kong, but I'm sure
you're
there's
also
plenty
right.
of people who speak Mandarin. Because, like, I mean, or perhaps it was published before the Chinese Communist Party took, which is actually entirely plausible now that you think about it. Journey to the Center of the Earth was written in the 1800s, so there could have been an edition that was translated before, you know, Mao banned most Western books.
Yeah.
That's probably how that happened.
Gosh,
that's
I'm
really interesting.
very intrigued now about how that inspired this. That's great. That's really cool. Side note, the other hilarious the other moment that I found laugh out loud funny was the memos that were going to be sent into space. The different drafts of them, and the first memo that is going to be sent into space is like a piece of just like socialist creed.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
the memo reply is something like, "This is utter crap. We can totally hang up propaganda posters here on the Earth, but can we not send them into space?"
Yeah, it's sort of like we're part of a state that is concerned with and disregard any messages you get from the United States, because those
It's
people want to you know, propagate poverty forever, and they're imperialists.
And even even the second draft is something like
It's similar things, but it says something more like, our nations disagree on how best to achieve the goals of prosperity, or so. It's a little bit more kind, you know, and it's
But our world is still flawed. Hate exists, as does prejudice and war, because of conflicts between the forces of production and the relations of production. Wealth distribution is extremely uneven, and large portions. It's like this hilarious, just like euphemisming of Marx. It's like, and that's the version that survives. Like that's the version that they're like, okay, send that. It's just. And that's, I just think there are moments that are just so funny in here that I really love.
And I do think the book does a really good job of depicting what it must be like to have lived through the Cultural Revolution and to live through a time where speech becomes very politicized, even, more so than it is in our country now, even though I would say we're kind of at a nadir, hopefully a nadir. Yeah. We're certainly at a low point. And I think it dramatizes that very well, and also sort of dramatizes how, and I actually think this is a big theme of Cixin Liu, is that often the way that that's overcome is simply by being endured, not by being conquered, by being endured. Ye Wenxia, her life is not so bad as an old lady, and she endures quite a bit, and of course she loses her daughter, which is terrible. But, she toughs it out and she survives. And, we meet her as this sort of calm elder who has had an interesting and maybe not even terrible life, despite some terrible trauma early on.
Yeah. Well, Upper Middlebrow is a Small Point production. Chris Bagg and Jesse Dukes are two rival factions of the same army. Music by Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes. Design and website by Chris Bagg. We are supported by Jenny Grieve and Justin Wright. Find us on Patreon, where there are a number of tiers that you could show your support at.
And a reminder, Bagg and I are both writers and editors and can help you with your writing, podcasting, or editing project. You can see some of our portfolios and learn more at our respective website, chrisbagg.com and jessedukes.com. Join us next time for part 2 of this wonderful novel, The Three-Body Problem by Cixin Liu. I'm so looking forward to hearing how you react to part 2.
I am so looking forward. I don't have time tonight, but I am probably going to say fuck that and keep reading regardless. I'm going to get some granola in the oven for camp and keep reading the book.